Hello, everyone. It's nice to see you in person. And thanks a lot for coming to this talk today, where we're going to talk about democratizing innovation in automotive with RISC-V and open source. So first of all, I'd like to take a second to introduce myself. At the top, you will see who am I. I think the Linux folks around here will recognize the command. Essentially, I'm Gordan Markuš, and I'm working at Canonical, where I'm working as the director of Silicon Alliances, and I'm leading our relationship with our partners in the RISC-V ecosystem. But my background is, of course, in Linux, open source software, coincidentally in automotive, and of course today with Ubuntu. So I'm kind of combined my two passions, that's open standards, open source software, as well as Ubuntu together in the automotive domain. I also spent my time in contributing to open automotive standards such as AUTOSAR, as well as to other open source initiatives in the automotive industry during my past. So that's why I think that it'll be quite interesting for you to hear what I'm about to say. As you might know, the automotive industry is facing rapid, let's say, innovation spur with certain trends that are coming up. But these trends also come with a set of really unique challenges that the automotive industry needs to tackle today. And that's why I made a small word cloud describing all the things that the automotive industry and the car manufacturer needs to take care about in order to create more efficient, more, let's say, performant, secure, reliable, and safe solutions to the market, right? Because we're building more and more capable mobility solutions, we're tackling certain problems that we haven't tackled before, right? Such as connectivity, safety, cybersecurity, software fragmentation, continuous testing and verification, configuration management challenges, as well as over-the-air app updates, along with a number of emerging automotive standards that are there to control that the solutions that are brought to the market are indeed safe and secure for the passengers and the users of those solutions. So that's why the automotive industry is leaning towards a certain trend of creating a more software-defined approach to creating their vehicles. So what does it mean when folks are talking about software-defined vehicles? Software-defined vehicles are, let's say, it's a terminology used for vehicles where their functions are defined more in software rather than in hardware itself. And the key reason behind that is, of course, agility, right? Software can be updated. It also can be changed during the lifetime of the vehicle much more easily than the hardware would be. But that being said, it doesn't mean that the hardware is not important. It's absolutely essential. So even though the vehicles are becoming software defined, they are in fact hardware enabled. And right now I want to also show you how did the hardware architecture inside of the vehicle change over time in order to adapt and enable software defined vehicles. And essentially how does RISC-V fit inside there. So the terminology that's being used inside of automotive is the EE architecture. And when we're talking about an EE architecture, we're talking about electronic and an electric architecture. So what does that mean? It means the convergence of all the wiring, of all the electronic control units, of all the processors that are inside of the vehicle itself. And if we look at the more traditional EE architecture, we will see that the vehicle would have like a multi-bus gateway in the center of the vehicle and a lot of distributed small ECUs and connected to sensors or actuators. An ECU is a term that's being used to denote an electronic control unit. So that is where, let's say, a processing unit is being placed inside of the vehicle. And usually, the modern vehicle has a large number of electronic control units of different shapes and sizes inside of them right now. So inherently, the EE architecture of a modern vehicle is really complex already as it is. And you see here that the central gateway is kind of pulling in all the signals and distributing them across the vehicle architecture in order to inform all the ECUs about the certain events that are happening inside of the vehicle. And the certain trend where the majority of the companies are moving to, or have already moved to, in fact, is the domain controller architecture. And in this architecture, we introduce the domain controller. And the domain controller is essentially an ECU that is vastly more powerful than a regular ECU that would deal with braking or steering control, but can actually consolidate multiple functions in a single ECU and can deliver a more, let's say, higher end and more performant use case to the end user. An example of a domain controller would be the infotainment system per se. In this domain controller architecture, still the central gateway is present. But moving forward, in order to fully embrace the software-defined vehicle architecture that is hardware-enabled, we need a zonal architecture with a central compute node. And what is the difference between the two architectures that we've shown previously? It's essentially the trend where a lot of the additional software consolidation and functions are moved into the central vehicle server that can act as a high-performance compute node for the whole vehicle. And that high-performance compute node should at the same time deal with workloads of mixed safety-critical functionality, which essentially means that the software running on top of this type of a node is becoming inherently more complex, and the node itself is hardware-wise more complex, but the whole vehicle architecture is simplified in a way that there's more commonality across the ECUs. So meaning that we have three types, from the main ECU to the domain controller, from the basic ECU to the domain controller, and then the vehicle server at the top. So when we look at this type of an architecture, we think about, okay, so what is the main goal of the OEM or the car manufacturer when building such an architecture? It's really to build a supply chain and a software and hardware strategy to enable the creation of reliable and reusable platforms. When we talk about reusable platforms, that's really key, right? Because we want to have innovation continuously being done and not have throwaway efforts, essentially. And when we're talking about reliable platforms, that includes both safety and security. So all of these platforms should be developed with safety and security in mind. And when we take a look at that previous architecture, and going forward, we're looking at RISC-V as an open standard instruction set that's emerging, and it's rapidly seizing, let's say, the hearts and minds of innovators around the world. We see that the RISC-V open ISA can actually help the software-defined vehicle and the hardware architecture that I just saw, because the single ISA can be used across all the ECUs. What does that mean, actually? It means that the car manufacturers can run away from proprietary lock-ins. They can increase code portability while also having the benefit and the flexibility to design their own IP if they choose to do so. They can also reduce costs and time to market because of the previous mentioned facts. And also the software and the ecosystem compatibility will be there. This is still a smaller gap that especially Canonical is working at right now, but we still believe that the software and ecosystem compatibility is going to increase, and that's why RISC-V in automotive is, let's say, an obvious choice. And we talk about RISC-V as an open ISA. The open standards in the automotive industry are, well, let's say they are standards. They exist for a long time already. So let's say the most common example is the CAN bus, a standard that has been developed as early as the early 80s by Bosch, and it's still existing in cars that are deployed today on the road, which is incredibly impressive. And when you look at the amount of standards and open standards that exist in the automotive ecosystem, it's really vast. And all of these standards actually helped the automotive and the mobility industry in creating better solutions year over year. And I just wrote down a few of those standards that are here, and just to introduce you with, for example, ASPICE, which is a standard that says how the automotive development process should look like. AEC-Q100, which talks about essentially how do we have to stress test the hardware inside of the vehicle, then EEC 61851, which is a new standard emerging due to the electrification of the vehicles. Then ISO 26262 dealing with automotive safety, ISO 21434 dealing with automotive security. But these standards are kind of there to and make sure that that this automotive grade solutions are done at a certain, let's say, quality and at a certain safety or security standard. And at the same time, there are other standards such as AUTOSAR Classic and Adaptive that exist there to increase commonality when building automotive grade solutions, which kind of create and standardize interfaces between software components inside the EE architecture. And then when you look at the success that the AUTOSAR had inside of the automotive industry and compare it to the potential that RISC-V as an open ISA could have in the automotive industry, you could really map it one-to-one and see the huge benefit that you can extract from that. And I also want to talk a bit about open source software, because that is what Canonical is all about, and the company that I'm working for, essentially. Well, open source in automotive has been already inside for quite a long time. And the key goal is to have software reuse across ECUs, and not just the ECUs, but also beyond. That means from the automotive cloud to the data center infrastructure to the development tools, all the way inside the ECU. So the more software commonality there is, the more code portability, the more productive, essentially, the development teams of car manufacturers can be. The product agility is higher, and we also minimize, let's say, proprietary lock-ins by using open source software solutions. So there's an immense amount of benefits in using open source. And the automotive industry realized that, and it's been already quite a while that they realized that. So according to a study from Flexera, 50 to 70% of software inside automotive is open source software, actually, which is really interesting, right? And at the same time, this comes as really amazing use. But we should also be mindful that when using open source software, we should keep on updating it. We should keep on making sure that the software we're using needs to be long-term maintained and supported. And according to the study from Upstream, 320% year-over-year increase in automotive-related CVEs happened between 2020 and 2021, which is a really huge number. So as much as open source has tremendous benefits, at the same time, the car manufacturers and the automotive industry needs to be mindful that we need to keep on continuously evaluating and securely patching the solutions that exist out there. And the reason why I'm mentioning that specifically is because that's something that is in our DNA inside of Canonical that we do across the industries and across the verticals. So we always make sure to point out to folks that using open source, it's an amazing thing, but at the same time, we need to ensure that that open source software is safe and secure. And then when we're talking about democratizing innovation by using RISC-V and using open source software coupled with automotive industry standards. So I really believe that if you put those three, let's say, components together, automotive standards that have been existing there for such a long time and keep on evolving year over year, together with the RISC-V Open ISA as a complement that can essentially implement a lot of those standards on the hardware level, then using open source software that will implement a lot of those standards in the software level, creating an ecosystem around it, and then enabling the automotive applications and functions to be developed on top. This really creates a thriving and competitive ecosystem where a lot of companies can build together certain solutions, and where they see differentiation, they can simply decide to innovate and to create that differentiation. But the key goal is always to create that best-in-class mobility experience and to enable the car manufacturers and at the end users to have the best possible experience, right? And this is one of the key goals that Canonical has inside of the automotive industry, and that's why we are really looking at RISC-V as one of the important pieces of our strategy. And that being said, is what does the RISC-V international community do when it comes to automotive? So earlier this fall, we launched an automotive special interest group. You can find more about our charter in the link that I put out here. And the key goals that our special interest group has is proposing interfacing with automotive industry bodies and initiatives. So as you might saw some of those standards that I mentioned previously, we will be analyzing them and seeing how we can engage more closely with them. We'll be also developing the ecosystem for supporting the operating systems, software, and tooling that are automotive specific within the RISC-V community. And at the end, I think the most important task is interfacing with other tasks groups or special interest group inside of the RISC-V community to enable advanced safety, security, and automotive-grade functionality and performance of RISC-V based systems. So all of you who are members, and I believe the majority of you here and online are RISC-V group members, I'd like to invite you to join our meetings, and you're more than happy to contact me on how to join and what we are doing there. And of course, I'm not acting there alone. There's a thriving community of folks, and we have a great leadership also put in place in that group. And that being said, I also want to point you out to our download page, or actually our RISC-V page, where you can download Ubuntu for RISC-V for multiple different development boards. So if you want to tinker at home, try out Ubuntu on the RISC-V, that's a great place to start. And you can also follow the news and the releases that we will be having, because there's definitely more things to come. So it's going to be a really exciting end of the year for us, plus an exciting 2023. Additionally to that, if you want to learn more about Canonical in automotive, feel free to follow the following link, ubuntu.com/automotive. And there's going to be an overlap between the two domains, and feel free to contact me if you have questions about either of those. So, and that being said, I'd like to thank you all, both the folks that are here in person as well as the others online. And I would like to invite you to our booth S7, where you can have a chat with our experts from multiple domains. So thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you. So we do have one question coming from the online audience. They are asking how much of the open source software in the automotive stack is GPL, and how do automotive companies handle license compliance?
That's a really great question. In generally, I can also share, it will be easier to share that on the presentation if I had that prepared, but in generally, GPL v3 software is something that is usually not included inside of the vehicle due to the clause which mandates the ability for the user of that product to update the software or, let's say, manually tinker with it. So GPL v3 software is not present inside of the vehicles as of today. That might change in the future, but there's no indications of that happening so far. GPL v2 is okay, though.
Great. We do not have any more questions online, but over here, questions?
I had a question about ASPICE. Is ASPICE starting to get supplanted by other standards like 26262? Is it still a prominent standard that is you see, an extended life for?
That's a really good question. And essentially, ASPICE can be complementary to ISO 26262. In a sense that ISO 26262 is a bit more stricter when it comes to, let's say, verification as well as claiming safety. But they follow kind of like the similar pattern on how the requirements are derived and how they're proven inside of the implementation following the V cycle. There are some overlaps between the two, but they're also complementary at the same time.
You're just trying to figure out what the adoption rate of that's going to be ultimately with the tier ones.
That's a good point. I believe that the car manufacturers are mandating their suppliers and the whole supply chain to adhere to ASPICE standards because they find it, as you saw in the vehicle architecture, the amount of folks involved in, let's say, building one vehicle, it could be over 100 different companies, right? So in order to manage such a complex ecosystem, these industry standards really help the car manufacturers to enforce and say, hey, could you please develop this according to this standards so that I can easily inspect the requirements I gave you, along with the implementation that you made and the tests that you're running on top of that. So that really simplifies, let's say, their work,
Okay.
and breeds better results at the end of the day.
Yeah, thanks.
Any more questions? One more here.
We are talking about both software and hardware to be open source, and the qualification against functional safety becomes difficult in that case. So how do we keep a pace or a track of it?
That's also yet a good question. So the trend is really to build, let's say, ASIL grade open source solutions. So there are several, let's say, interest groups that exist outside there, like ELISA, to name one, that is tackling this problem. And Canonical will also tackle this problem soon. But I believe from the hardware perspective, with the open ISA, there's already solutions with dual lockstep and so on that enable functional safety. So I don't believe in hardware there should be a huge problem. But in software, that also shouldn't be a problem, but it's just a matter of time before we decide how to embark on this path.
Okay, giving another twist to the problem. So we work on a certain spec, like spec A, right? So the functional safety says that we qualify against the process against spec A. But being open source, we will, before the certification process completes, we move to spec B, which is the latest one. So how do we adapt to these changes against functional safety or security processes?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. Essentially, in that case, I believe that what a lot of the previous, let's say, like my experience when having such an open standard and trying to be safety compliant when you have a, let's say, a moving target, right, is that you prepare all the paperwork, and until the safety, let's say, the safety claim that you want to make on a certain use case, you kind of need to do it at that point in time. But you do the 90% of the work beforehand, and once that goalposts move, you just finish that last 10%, if that makes sense.
Yeah, kind of, yes.
Right.
Any more questions? So this is the last before the break. So
yeah, thank you first. Yeah, and I'd like to ask you about these days I see that the automotive, the standardization committees are now making some liaison with the multiple, the different committees, like some SAEs that published it in 2016, the SAJ 31, 3661. Yeah, 61, and then it is replaced by the ISO SAE, the 21434. And also there has some standard like SAE J3101. It's about some hardware protected security. So what is the main scope of this RISC-V, the automotive, the standardization group? Then depends on that. Do you have any plan to make some connection to the other committee that to improve the more well?
Yes, absolutely, and thanks a lot for bringing that up. So our key goal is really to analyze all the committees that are out there and see how that work would impact the RISC-V instruction set architecture, and then make connections and make sure that other special interest group, for example, that are dealing with the CPU architecture inside of RISC-V, that they're aware of what their implementations need to be when it comes to safety, security, and other elements.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
No problem at all. Thanks for the question.
I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, everyone.